Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Perfect Prey. I'm glad you're here. My name is Dr. Christine Marie Cocciola, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have a doctorate in clinical social welfare, where I researched coercive control and the impact on both adult and child victims. Most importantly, I am a survivor and a protective parent. Victims and survivors of coercive control are never to blame. But I chose the name Perfect Prey because coercive controllers, who are individuals who apparently have characterologically disordered personalities, do choose who to prey upon. They choose people who tend to be agreeable and conscientious, perhaps loyal to a fault, fixers, optimistic, and empathic. Or these coercive controllers prey upon those who are most vulnerable, including our children. It's part of their plan to gain control. How do we help our children when they're experiencing systematic, unacknowledged child abuse? We need to understand how these coercive controllers, harmful individuals, attempt to exert their power over us and our children. We need to look beyond a trauma-informed lens, but also layer it with a coercive control lens. So, let's engage in personal power conversations that will create the protective parts that will derail the coercive controller from his plan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of Perfect Prey. I'm so glad you're here. I left off last episode in talking about the various ways that these harmful individuals, these coercive controllers, aka narcissistic abusers, how they inflict their harm. We talked about psychological abuse, including how nuanced it can be. I often hear victims say, if he had only hit me, because at least then the abuse is indisputable. Covert abuse is just that much harder to recognize, even to victims themselves. We gaslight ourselves into believing the relationship will work out, that things will improve, that it isn't as bad as we think it might be. And then we hold on to the good memories as intensely as possible. It feels safer to stay with the good memories versus the bad memories. This is our brain's safety net. It's the way that our brain protects us. Our brain wants us to continually look back to those good times versus the bad. Our brain actually asks us in some ways to disassociate from the bad because the bad does not feel good. All of these abuses, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the intimidation, the isolation, are all intended, as Dr. Evan Stark states, to take away our liberty, to take away our freedoms. He doesn't like to highlight the psychological abuse as an abuse in and of itself. He says it's a strategy to take away a victim's freedom. And for our children, it is the same. It's an inability to behave how they want to behave, to be who they want to be. For me, from a clinical perspective, this all leads back to the inability to be authentic, to know deep inside that we are loved just the way we are. Children need this desperately, but in these relationships, they lose this. They lose this because the coercive controller has given them criteria to receive love. The love from the coercive controller is conditional. Even if only subconsciously, our children know they have to behave a certain way to receive that love. The problem is that the coercive controller sets up our children to think the same from the protective parent. They feel betrayed by the protective parent because they believe the protective parent truly doesn't love them unconditionally. That is definitely what I'm going to begin unpacking in episode 5. Let's finish up right now the defining characteristics of coercive control. If we look at the lens of coercive control that he gives us, Dr. Stark, then we can see that the financial abuse is yet another strategy of the crime of the coercive controller to take away our liberty. It's a taking away of financial independence, of the resources that victims and survivors have worked so hard for or that they deserve. perhaps their financial stature, their savings, and even for some, their housing. 99% of victims and survivors of coercive control, the research says domestic abuse, but as you know, I say coercive control is the foundation of all domestic abuse, and I prefer to use the term coercive control. 99% suffer financial abuse. That financial abuse may have been going on throughout the course of the relationship without the victim even being aware of it. Like so many other things, it can be covert and it also can be overt. It could mean that a victim is not allowed to work or that she's only allowed to work in certain places. It could mean that the victim is on a budget, or it could mean that the victim is giving more, contributing more unequally to the family budget. In the case of many victims and survivors, I know that any discussion about a budget is met with hostility. I know that it is avoided. I recall working so diligently to try to sit down on a Saturday morning and come up with a budget, knowing that there was money missing, knowing it, but knowing every time I did that, I literally ruined a Saturday or I ruined a weekend by simply bringing it up. Now, of course, I didn't ruin it, but it felt like it. It felt like I was creating more challenges. So what did I do? I avoided it. I began to avoid it. We know that the characterological traits of these individuals leads them to have a great deal of envy, envy being one of the deadly seven sins, right? They want what others have and they covet what they have. This leads to the need to exert power and control in the realm of finances. It makes perfect sense. It makes sense when we think about how powerful people use their money to exert control over others. We see this happening all of the time. Money and power is so related. It can be happening to us without us even knowing it's occurring. I have so many protective moms who come forward and tell me that they didn't even know they weren't on the deed of the house. They didn't know that their ex had lost their job. I have one client, her ex was going to quote unquote work every day. In the meantime, 2 years later, she gets the foreclosure notice in the mail. He wasn't going to work every day. The reality is that it's all about creating a space to have power over one person and to harm the family system. It doesn't matter. There is no ability to feel sadness or remorse for doing something wrong. So some of these abusers might put you on a budget or perhaps not allow you to get a manicure or a massage when you have a neck ache, whatever it is. It's an attempt to financially constrain you. So monitoring all that you are spending is part of that. This is a person who may be keeping tabs on where you spend your money, on your credit card use. It's, again, as Dr. Evan Stark states, bigger than that, though. It is a monitoring of time and space. It's a monitoring of our lives. It is taking away our freedom. Yes, of course, we see financial abuse play out in the legal system. We call it vexatious litigation. We know that these abusers love the court system. It becomes their stage to perform. They will use the court and the legal system to further financially abuse. It keeps the court system involved. It makes victims and survivors exhausted. It is time consuming and, of course, financially taxing. Time off from work can lead to unemployment, never mind the traumatic reactions of having to continually be met with the adversity of this characterologically disordered individual in the courtroom, knowing full well that they're performative and that judges and lawyers may not pick up on this. It truly is institutional betrayal. The systems in and of themselves participating in the coercive control. So many examples of this. I had a client whose partner didn't have an attorney. So that seems like it's going to be non-adversarial. It's going to be more easily resolved. Well, actually, what it meant is that this partner would change their mind throughout the day in the court. So they'd go to family relations in the morning, maybe by 10:30 have an agreement, but then the coercive controller would change his mind. So then they'd have to go back, try to resolve, and that would maybe bring them to one. And then there'd be a lunch break from 1 to 2 or however long the court took a break. And then they'd meet up after that. And by then, court would be closing. That client paid all day for her attorney, yet the coercive controller didn't pay anything. It was a ploy. It was truly a trap to make her spend more money throughout the day. Of course, there are stories, you all know them, of victims and survivors being pulled into court on false contempt charges. This is what happens. Or needing to go back to court to get something simple. Something simple like, for me, the title of my car so that my car wouldn't be unregistered. I went back 3 times. The third time I didn't pay for the attorney, but the first 2 times I did, he didn't show up. He wasn't held accountable. And in that, I didn't have the title of my car. That's a whole nother story. I did finally get it, but not through the legal system, not after paying for attorneys. Colleagues and I often discuss the issues of lawyers and judges not wanting to recognize coercive control occurring. The reasoning behind that. Is it because they're afraid of retaliation? We recently heard of a judge being murdered in Maryland for standing up and creating the right response to a victim and survivor's circumstances. Heartbreaking that this happened, this tragedy happened, because that's what coercive controllers do, is if they lose, they need to exert control in other ways. I'm truly hopeful that this case is going to highlight the anatomy, character traits of these abusers. It's the missing component, in my opinion, for all of these situations. How is it that if we know that someone has these character traits, then we can protect, but how is it that we're not actually recognizing that? Again, I'm hoping this horrifying case actually does that. So is it out of fear of retaliation? Maybe. Is it because there's ignorance? Well, then let's educate you. Let's talk about what this really looks like. Or is it that they also have similar character traits? Think about it. I'm not trying to suggest this is all judges and lawyers, but there is a position of power in being a judge and a lawyer. Is it possible that there is this dismissal, this diminishing of experiences of others, quote unquote others, because it's not relevant to my life as a judge or a lawyer? I don't know anyone, or I don't think I know anyone, because we all know someone who's experienced this. So it's not my problem. So it's easier for me to dismiss it or diminish it. So, you know, certainly we know that lawyers, I've heard this personally. I know this by going through a GAL training, that if you are known as an advocate for victims and survivors, you can lose some credibility. If you're trying to be successful, if you're trying to have a successful law practice, then do you want to really get known as someone who supports victims and survivors? First of all, victims and survivors often can't pay you. They're not the moneyed partner. So you're not going to be making as much money, perhaps. But also in that, are victims and survivors unable to have credibility? And in that lack of credibility, due to systemic oppression, due to coercive control, frankly, in that, do I, as a judge or a guardian ad litem or a forensic evaluator or a custody evaluator, do I want that reputation that I support victims and survivors? Because when I go back to court, am I going to be perceived that way? And then I'm not going to get on the list, quote unquote, to get hired. So, of course, is the system engaged in the coercive control itself? Think about that globally. Think about that on a macro level. And is that actually preventing lawyers and judges and other court professionals from really standing up for victims and survivors? I don't know. I kind of do wonder. It seems to me that the systems of coercion and control has these lawyers and judges backed into a place where they will lose their livelihood, their stature, their employment, and perhaps their reputation. I'm insinuating that if we're going to protect and support victims and survivors, then we need to support lawyers and judges from the destigmatization of their goals in supporting victims and survivors. They want to be successful in their law practice. They want to make good money. They went to school. They deserve it. Maybe they're overcharging. We know that occurs. Is that another form of coercion and control? Sure. But they're not necessarily understanding that this stigma that is being carried is wrong and inappropriate. And so they're taking on clients to have a thriving business, oftentimes taking on the money parent, the money partner. How do we show them otherwise? How do we show them that that shame that victims and survivors and the stigma that comes with that needs to be abolished? So is it true that sometimes they might make choices that are harmful to clients, that they might diminish the experiences of their clients? This is another example of that legal abuse that occurs. It doesn't just occur in the courtroom. It occurs in the relationships that are created outside the courtroom. It is institutional betrayal. A victim comes forward, isn't heard. No one really acknowledges the abuse, never mind the abuse of our children, which I promise, are getting to in our next episode. Never mind all of these betrayals that are occurring. And so, what happens? It's the perfect opportunity for the coercive controller. The stage is set. As Rosenfeld and colleagues told us in 2019, the research shows us these people are drawn towards conflict and they love the courtroom as their stage. They love the suffering. They can't handle the shame of anyone abandoning them, and you have escaped. You have attempted to escape. It's never truly escape, is it? And so they're going to show up in a way that they have more power and control, and then the system in and of itself plays part in that. What to do? I always say to victims and survivors, whatever you can walk away from, however you can strategize, the coercive controller has quote unquote won, make that person think that they won something so that you actually walk away with your peace of mind. And of course, more than anything, more time with your children. What can you walk away from? Is it college support or other financial support? Is it perhaps items in the home? Or in some people, I know they walk away from the home. Is there a freedom of letting go versus trying hard to get what's fair? There is no justice in this. Very rarely do clients get justice. I hardly ever see it. The justice isn't there. So what can you walk away from? What can you strategize staying 2 steps ahead of the coercive controller? They're smart and savvy, but you are so much smarter. As soon as we put this coercive control lens and we look at what's going on through the coercive control goggles, I call them, we can see what they're trying to do, but we can be so much smarter and savvier if we know how to play it. Their egos are so pathetically compromised that will grab at anything if they think that they have won. So the financial abuse is exerted through the legal system, and this is again legal abuse. And you're going to be called back to court over and over again unless you're able to let go of the rope. What can you leverage? What can you make the coercive controller think that you really want and that you're sad about losing? But in that, you actually get exactly what matters most. He revels in you losing. So what can you capitalize on? I hope that this all makes sense. It really is about strategy. And in that, there's personal power. If we can actually feel like we have gotten what really, really matters, there's personal power. The more that we are engaged in the court system, the more that we lose our footing, the more harm it is to us psychologically and to our children. Some of you can't let go. Some of you, there's too much at stake. I get it. Absolutely, I get it. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about the people who don't have as much at stake. I'm talking about finding the peace, knowing that they're going to continually weaponize the court system against you, and finding the peace that you can by walking away from as much as you can, letting go of the rope, strategizing, staying 2 steps ahead of them. Remember, whatever you are holding on to, he is using your children in that process to weaponize against you. So whatever you can let go of. So I promise that we'll be talking about the weaponization of children in episode 5. And I look forward to seeing you then. Please subscribe and feel free to leave me comments. Also rate this podcast. The more that you rate it, the more the word will get out that it might be something useful for other people. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to Perfect Prey. You can find the show on my website at iknowyourheart.com or courseofcontrolconsulting.com, or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love your feedback, and I'm always looking for ideas on how to continue to expose coerced control as the significant harm and child abuse that it is. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Perfect Prey on Apple Podcasts. It helps others to find us. Perfect Prey is written by me, Dr. Christine Cocciola, and with the help of my amazing assistant, Sheena Pastor. Thank you, and have a great day, everyone.